Hey everyone, John here! And to kick off 2025, I want to pay my respects to one of my favourite game consoles of all time, the SEGA Dreamcast, giving us basically the biggest graphical leap we've ever had, introduced online play to consoles, gave us a second screen with the VMU, and so many timeless games. But before we check this stuff out, first, a word from our sponsor.
It's a new year, and like so many people, my goal is to eat better. But I love cereal. Thanks to today's sponsor, Magic Spoon, I don't have to worry. Magic Spoon cereal has 0 sugar per serving, and their amazing treats have just 1 gram of sugar per bar. They're great for carb counters like me, and they contain no artificial ingredients. Even better than that, Magic Spoon tastes amazing. It's got the same great taste we all love, with more protein and less sugar. Magic Spoon cereals are all the flavors I remember loving as a kid, but upgraded with grown-up ingredients. The cereal has 13 to 14 grams of protein, 0 sugar, and 4 to 5 grams of net carbs in each serving, meaning I can finally feel great about having a bowl of cereal for breakfast. And their treats are great for when I need to run out the door, with 11 to 12 grams of protein, 1 gram of sugar, and just 1 to 2 grams of net carbs per bar, and they aren't sticky the way protein bars are. I never thought I could eat better and enjoy something this delicious, so why don't you join me and pick some up today? Use my code GVG or click the link in the description to try Magic Spoon cereal or treats today and get $5 off. You can also find Magic Spoon on Amazon or in your nearest grocery store. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee online. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. So click the link in the description to go to magicspoon.com/GVG or scan the QR code on the screen for $5 off. Thanks to Magic Spoon for sponsoring today's video.
In 1998, Japan was graced with one of the greatest consoles of all time, the SEGA Dreamcast. 60 FPS games, arcade-perfect ports, dual screens, online play, motion controls, Sonic Shuffle. It was all here. The PlayStation was more or less 3 years old, and the N64 too, and the jump was indescribable. The Dreamcast delivered the PlayStation 2 era early, with some of the coolest games ever produced that were miles ahead of the competition. The GD-ROM allowed twice as much storage space as a standard CD, letting Sega's sound team go to town on generation-defining soundtracks. And that extra horsepower provided timeless versions of multi-platform games like Rayman 2, achieving 60 FPS, widescreen, and 480p through VGA output. Still to this day, the best iteration of Rayman 2 by far. The rest of the world got it a year later in 1999, and in Europe especially, Dreamcast's jump can't be understated, finally making 60Hz a standard across the bulk of its library. Essentially, every major game now comes with a 50Hz or 60Hz toggle right when you boot it up. And this was still a rarity years on PlayStation 2 and GameCube and Xbox. Now, that's not to say that PAL has complete parity with NTSC, as some games just bizarrely don't support VGA. They couldn't let us have it too good, I suppose. All of this came from a small, compact, and slightly yellowed box. The sun hasn't been too kind to my Dreamcast over the years. Dreamcast soon died an untimely death only 1.5 years after its American launch in March of 2001. Yet, it achieved more in that year and a half than most consoles ever achieve. What did you do, PS5, in your first year and a half? Yeah, you looked at me. Dreamcast gave us masterpiece after masterpiece. Choo Choo Rocket, one of the greatest multiplayer games of all time. Phantasy Star Online, a full-on MMO that people still play today. Crazy Taxi, one of the greatest arcade games ever, running at 60 FPS and with the Offspring soundtrack intact. That's very important. Power Stone, one of the greatest Capcom fighting games ever. Street Fighter 3, one of the greatest Capcom fighting games ever. Marvel vs. Capcom 2, one of the greatest Capcom fighting games ever. It is flooded with all-time greats, and at least on Sega's side, the bulk of them were brand new IPs. Space Channel 5, Jet Set Radio, Virtua Tennis, Samba de Amigo, the Chow Garden with a Sonic game attached to it. Everything about the Dreamcast was so fresh, and the games all seemed to tie together with a theme of bright blue skies. Ignore that one. Once Sega went third-party, a bulk of these games did find their way elsewhere. Sonic Adventure games are on the GameCube, Skies of Arcadia is on the GameCube, Shenmue 2 went to Xbox, Crazy Taxi went everywhere, but there's still enough exclusives to make Dreamcast incredibly worthwhile to collect, and almost every game I mentioned is still best played on Dreamcast. The VMU, Visual Memory Unit, adds so much personality to games. Now, it is true that the bulk of them just kind of remind you what you're playing with a lo-fi logo, in case you forget. But others, like Resident Evil 2 here, go full dual screens. The primary screen is just as atmospheric as any other version, there's no HUD, nothing breaking the immersion, but down on the VMU is what's usually on the pause screen, your health and your ammo count. This is a really handy time saver and is kind of the Wii U before the Wii U. And in Virtua Tennis, you don't even have to look at the TV. You can play the entire game on the VMU, even though it might be a little bit trickier, but I still think this is the raddest thing in the world. But perhaps even radder is Sonic Shuffle, which goes beyond what the Wii U tried to do 14 years later. Here, everyone has their own screen showing them what cards they have. It's all kept a mystery on the TV, and you can just choose anyone's card at random, but obviously you know what cards you have in your hand. So as long as every controller has a VMU in it, everyone has their own information personalized to them. And this is only really possible on original hardware. You can't really do this via emulation, not without everyone seeing what cards you have. Maybe this is part of why Sonic Shuffle has a bad reputation. People just haven't played it as it's meant to be played. Because honestly, it's a pretty good game, made by Hudson, the original Mario Party developers. Every Dreamcast comes fresh out of the box with a modem for dial-up connection. The tech soon became outdated and a broadband adapter was released, but if anything, what you get from the box, just the standard dial-up connection, is more handy today. With a Raspberry Pi hooked up with DreamPi firmware, you can take your standard Ethernet connection and convert it to dial-up, and then connect to Dreamcast Live fan servers to essentially bring any online game back to life via emulated dial-up. And people absolutely still do this. Phantasy Star Online is always active. I went on a random Thursday at around 2 PM, and there was someone there immediately waiting to play with me. You can play multiplayer games like Quake 3, Choo Choo Rocket, Bomberman, Daytona USA, and others even have DLC, like Sonic Adventure, which we've looked at before. We're talking DLC exclusive missions in the hub world, weird crossover promotions where Sonic's gotta find a bunch of Reebok, holiday-themed costumes like Halloween and Christmas, and exclusive racetracks. Even the Chow Black Market, which I thought was exclusive to the GameCube version, had an early iteration through the web store where you can buy eggs by spending your emblems from the main game. A bunch of other games had DLC as well, like Skies of Arcadia and Rayman 2, all ranging from VMU games to full-on boss battles and islands. And through a very dedicated preservation effort, almost all of it is readily available and easy to play. Though of course PSO is the most popular, it's going to take you a while to find someone in Choo Choo Rocket without actually organizing it yourself, but people should be playing Choo Choo Rocket, it's one of the best games ever. But as cool as DLC in 1998 is, it definitely highlights a weak point of the VMU. These things can barely store anything. Anything substantial will fill up almost the entire VMU, so it's a miracle anything was actually preserved. Sonic Adventure's DLC takes up most of the VMU, but there's also VMU games like Chow Adventure. A bunch of Dreamcast games let you install mini-games directly to the VMU to play untethered from the console, like a Tamagotchi almost. So Chow Adventure doesn't actually require a Dreamcast. You can take this out of the controller and play it anywhere. Chow Adventure is quite similar to the Chow Garden from Sonic Advance, even has the same fruit matching minigame, and it's just really rad to raise this like a Tamagotchi anywhere in the world. You can see Chow stats here that you can't see in the main game, and just raise your Chow on what's essentially a portable console. You can even hook two VMUs up together for multiplayer from the VMU. They went so hard making a second screen and kind of a separate console that they also kind of forgot to make a good memory card. You are going to need a bunch of these. Although nowadays you can get products like the VMU Pro, which has way more memory and a backlit screen, so at least in the modern day it's not quite so cumbersome. Dreamcast did almost everything right. Unlike Saturn, there's 4 controller ports right on the system, giving you incredible multiplayer without any multi-tap adapters. The controller itself, while not perfect, this thing has a very slippery analog stick, it also uses Hall effect technology, so this thing can never drift. These things are incredibly well built. Although Dreamcast's Japanese release predates the DualShock controller, and so we're left with a single stick device. Its absence honestly isn't felt too strongly in most games as they're built around fixed cameras, but with the occasional game you kinda wish there was a second stick there, especially for things like Half-Life. Although, the triggers are full analog. Most PS2 racers still use the X button to accelerate, just a digital input, but Dreamcast was way ahead of the curve with proper analog acceleration. Racing games are awesome on this thing. You can also decide whether the wire comes from the bottom, like usual, or hook it up to the top like this. I don't really understand why this is the way it is. I guess it's to communicate whether you're a top or a bottom to passerbys. I don't know. You had accessories like the light gun, with an arcade-perfect version of House of the Dead 2, one of the greatest light gun games ever. A fishing rod for SEGA bass fishing. And while this game is cooler than it seems, so is the fishing rod. Like, this is a full-on motion controller. Some games like Virtua Tennis support it for motion-controlled tennis 8 years before Wii Sports. This is real. I know it sounds like I'm making it up, but you actually can play tennis with the fishing rod. Samba de Amigo is so cool too. There's a sensor bar on the floor which measures how far away the maracas are, and after telling the game your height, it can tell exactly where your arms are in 3D space, which gives you so much more precise motion control than the Wii version, which kinda struggles, and this came out in 1999. Shenmue! This was kind of our first taste of a high-budget open-world game. Although it was still broken up by load screens, so you can argue whether it's really open world, but few other games just let you roam around a town and take each day as it comes. Though this game is also kinda responsible for the death of the Dreamcast. From everything I've said, you might think, gee John, why did this console only last a year and a half? It sounds like the coolest thing ever. And unfortunately, it was out of the Dreamcast's hands. This thing was dead the moment it arrived. Sega had messed up the Sega CD, the 32X, the Saturn, and games like Sonic Adventure and Shenmue were in development through the entirety of the Saturn's life, only to be rebuilt for the Dreamcast. And these weren't cheap games. Shenmue was the most expensive game of all time at that point, coming in at $70 million. And while people like to argue which game's better, Sonic Adventure 1 or Sonic Adventure 2, the answer is Adventure 1 by the way, Adventure 1 was definitely the more expensive game, with a bigger team, much higher budget, which I think you can feel in the levels, and yes, it was originally a Saturn game too. But despite all of this, Dreamcast had a very successful 1.5 years. It had the biggest console launch ever, and hardware units were approaching the 10 million mark, which is pretty close to Wii U's 13 million, despite much less time on the market. The console itself wasn't a failure, but at that point, Sega as a company were. The other consoles coming along soon after with much stronger hardware and a DVD player didn't help either, especially as one of them was the PlayStation 2. But the Dreamcast never really had a chance. It was dead from conception. And it also wasn't helped that EA shunned the system entirely, keeping it devoid of sports games, even though Sega sports games were better anyway. The people yearn for Virtua Tennis, they just don't know it yet. The Dreamcast ends up standing as a transitional console between PS1 and PS2. It didn't live long enough to get multi-platform PS2 games, but its capabilities weren't a whole realm away. Rockstar once considered Dreamcast for GTA 3 before it was refocused as a PlayStation 2 exclusive, and fascinatingly, fans made that vision happen. DCA 3 had its first playable alpha build released only a week ago, and this is the entirety of GTA 3 running on the Dreamcast. The performance can definitely be improved, but it's incredibly impressive. This port would have officially been very possible, and it begs the question of whether more PlayStation 2 games could have found a home on the Dreamcast. Half-Life nearly made it. An official port was fully complete, but unreleased due to changing market conditions, and that's code for the Dreamcast being discontinued. Again, the performance was a bit spotty, and they filled this version with a bunch of load screens, but it's still fascinating that these two games can run at all. The Dreamcast homebrew scene is still pretty busy to this day. both with ports like GTA 3 and Cave Story, and completely original games. This is all possible because of a mill CD exploit. While Dreamcast couldn't play DVDs, it did have full-motion CDs known as mill CDs. Albeit with a very small line only releasing in Japan, and later on mill CD compatibility would be taken away because it was used for piracy. People couldn't beat the copy protection on GD-ROMs, or even produce their own GD-ROMs. But they could repurpose games into mill CDs, making it incredibly easy to burn your own copies. It feels like the Dreamcast has no copy protection, but it's actually quite secure, at least if it weren't for this mill CD exploit. Although running Dreamcast games on standard CDs does mean you're compressing them by about half, because GD-ROMs are 1.4 GB and CDs are 700 MB, and you definitely can see where these games are compressed, both in full motion video and the audio being way less punchy. PlayStation 2 was the default console of its generation, and a huge chunk of third parties made their games exclusively for it. Because of that, the PlayStation 2's library feels endless. You can walk into a used game store and walk out with an awesome game you've never heard of before. That is not really the case with Dreamcast or GameCube. They both have excellent games, but most people end up playing the exact same thing. We have all played the obvious ones like Sonic Adventure, Crazy Taxi, Shenmue. But Dreamcast then has sequels: Sonic Adventure 2, Crazy Taxi 2, Shenmue 2, Space Channel 5 Part 2. Outside of Sonic Adventure 2, those are perhaps a bit more niche. But then, of course, there are also hidden gems, like Super Magnetic Neo, a Crash Bandicoot-style platformer with dedicated buttons for magnetic polarity. This game rocks, and it's one of the first games I ever actually played. You've also got Pen Pen, an on-foot racer, but as the track goes on, suddenly you shift to swimming or skiing. It's kind of like Sonic and All-Stars Racing transformed, but way earlier, and with penguins. Dreamcast also debuted some of the coolest third-party games that you may have played on other systems, but they released first on Dreamcast, like Ikaruga. People most likely associate that with the GameCube, at least in the West, but in Japan, it came out first on Dreamcast. Same with Rez, came out first on Dreamcast. Grandia 2, first on Dreamcast. You end up with a really nicely rounded library, even if a lot of these would come to PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox later on. Take that, PS2. You don't have Evolution 1 or 2. How embarrassing. Through all its hurdles, Dreamcast remained one thing: interesting. It didn't give us safe sequels to Saturn games. Sega's teams were turning genres on their head and giving us things we didn't even know we wanted. This was an era of pure fun. The visuals were fun, the games were fun, and the new things you could do, whether it came from the VMU or playing online with other people, were fun. To this day, Dreamcast games still look awesome. I don't think anyone could look at Soul Calibur and say, that doesn't look very good. This thing hasn't aged a day, and it runs at 60 FPS. And by the way, you can play Soul Calibur with the fishing rod. And there's also a VMU DLC visual novel. PS2 wouldn't do this kind of thing for you. It was different. Weird, quirky, different. And while I wish it could have lived a full life, Dreamcast did more with its limited time than just about anyone. Despite being discontinued in 2001, Sega actually released this in 2004, an official Dreamcast port of Puyo Puyo Fever, only in Japan. But you can play the entire thing in English from the options menu, complete with full English voice acting, and even an English VMU logo. One other radical thing about this version is you can install a Dreamcast menu image to the VMU, and what this does is it makes the home screen real. This is real mode. Just press the start button and... damn, this is real mode! And just as we're wrapping up, I love the blue swirl in Europe. I think it's a nice swirl, it's red everywhere else, but these boxes will be the death of me. They are so fragile. Even if you touch it the wrong way, they'll just shatter into a billion pieces. A few of my games are just missing the front of the box, and I don't know where they've gone. One day it was there, the next it was gone. If you think an American jewel case is flimsy, then just touch a European one, okay? At least the European ones gave us an extra slot for extra discs, because they knew how many people burned Dreamcast games. That's what they're there for, right? To put your copies? It's very considerate.
チューチューロケットネズミを助けろチューチューロケット猫は怖いチューチューロケットすごいズババババー
歌がたくさんバズるチューチューロケット2800円安い Dreamcast!
To this day, I still play the Dreamcast very regularly. If friends come over, you know we're booting up Choo Choo Rocket, we're playing Soul Calibur, or Power Stone, or I'm raising a Chow in the Chow Garden. There's just so many integral games in this thing, and I can't really imagine gaming without it. It introduced so many core things, but despite everything that it did, its library is one of the best. Yes, it's limited, but the games it does have are just some of the best of all time. And if I didn't grow up with this thing, I'm not sure I'd be the person I am today with the tastes I have today. So I owe being here to the Dreamcast. This formed so much of who I'd become, and I really do love this thing. So thank you so much for watching, and this is going to be a banger of a year. Hopefully this is the best GVG year we've ever had, and you know it's going to be that way because we're starting with the Dreamcast. Thanks everyone.